Hello, my name is Ned, and I'm the host of BlackBoxOnlineRadio. Welcome to the debunking series, but I have one announcement before we begin. I have just received my copy of America's Jack the Ripper by Soren Korsgaard, so please look out for a book discussion about this here on Black Box Online Radio, and if you haven't hit the like button and subscribed yet, now's a great time to do so. Today I wanted to talk about the Zodiac killer suspect Earl Van Best, and as you see, he is featured in the debunking series. This is a series where I wanted to talk about suspects that I think are absolutely not the Zodiac killer. Earl Van Best became a suspect mostly because of his biological son, Gary Stewart, who went on to write a book called The Most Dangerous Animal of All. Gary Stewart was working with two people who are more or less co-writers, Susan Mustafa and Michael Wachsel. Michael Wachsel went on to author a companion book to Gary Stewart's book called The End of the Zodiac Killer Mystery, and Michael Wachsel promotes himself as a handwriting expert. In an interview that he did with the Buffalo News, he stated that he didn't really know Gary Stewart that well. Most of his interactions were with Susan Mustafa, so she becomes a questionable character in all of this. The points against Earl Van Best being the Zodiac killer is that, number one, he seems like he is way too thin to be the Zodiac. Number two, Gary Stewart's book is filled with numerous inaccuracies, talking about how Earl Van Best would have learned about the Mikado living in Japan when the Mikado was banned in Japan, and all the Zodiac Killer references to the Mikado, writing things like Titwillow, 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 which is directly from Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. How would he have learned that in Japan if the play had been banned there? Musical, I should say, operetta. Maybe that's a more just term. Also, the Hulu documentary series, I believe it was actually from FX, but I saw it on Hulu, that presented a case for Earl Van Best being the Zodiac killer, and also challenged the case, mind you, pointed out that Gary Stewart created this theory of how Earl Van Best murdered Sherry Jo Bates on October 30th of 1966, that he would have driven his car from California down to Mexico, where he worked as more or less an antique salesman. He would acquire books and old documents, and even took up document forgery for a while. So says Gary Stewart, so says Susan Mustafa. And then he would have driven through Riverside, California, and then he saw Sherry Jo Bates and was overcome with rage because of something that happened in his life, and he stabbed her to death, October 30th, 1966. The problem with that is, it's provided by Gary Stewart's own mother, Judith Chandler, the ex-wife of Earl Van Best Jr., that he did not drive to Mexico on these antique finding expeditions. He flew. And I even thought about that because Gary Stewart places Earl Van Best in Mexico City, and I was like, well, it's theoretically possible to drive from the San Francisco Bay Area to Mexico City, but that's a long drive. He flew by plane, of course. So that's another strike against Gary Stewart. We're putting something in his book that isn't completely accurate. So I think I just have to get to the heart of the issue. The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary Stewart and Susan Mustafa is not even an honest attempt at presenting a Zodiac killer case. If you have read that book, you'll see what I'm talking about. I have read that book. If you read it, you will know exactly what I'm sharing with you, because the first 24 chapters have nothing to do with the Zodiac killer. It's about the life of Earl Van Best as a biography, and then once you get closer to the end, they just have these things that at first I described them as paraphrasing Robert Graysmith's narrative and the Zodiac letters, and it's not even connected to Earl Van Best. It's just paraphrasing the material. But there is one point that Susan Mustafa did correct me on, and in that same FX special, she said, it's not directly paraphrasing Robert Graysmith's narrative, it was paraphrasing the police reports. They wrote this biography on Earl Van Best Jr., and then they paraphrased the police reports. This is how he did Lake Herman Road. This is how he did Blue Rock Springs. This is how he did Lake Berryessa, and this is how he did Paul Stein's murder. It's not even an honest attempt at connecting the two, which is a shame, because there's a very big true crime story in the life of Earl Van Best. He was involved in a nationwide scandal known as the Sunday Bride or the Ice Cream Romance, about how this guy, Earl Van Best Jr., was actually a sexual predator. And he would wait for a girl to come off the school bus named Judith Chandler. And she was 13 years old and he was in his mid to late 20s. And then he would lure her to Herbert's Sherbert shop, an ice cream parlor. And the person writing that stuff about the Sunday Bride and the ice cream romance was none other than the journalist Paul Avery. If you would like to hear more about this book, I have an 8-part book discussion on Earl Van Best and the Most Dangerous Animal of All, available here on Black Box Online Radio. It's one of the few books that I beg you not to buy. Everything you will want to know about that book is in those uploads, way more detailed than you will find in the FX special, but keep the volume on low. As far as Earl Van Best being a Zodiac killer suspect, Michael Wachtel tried to connect him to the letters by saying that Earl Van Best's handwriting was very strongly matched. Michael Wachtel is a handwriting expert. He's measuring the angles. He is examining the way the handwriting has been written. But the problem was, almost immediately after Michael Wachtel's book came out, he says that the handwriting sample that he was comparing from Earl Van Best's marriage certificate to Judith Chandler wasn't written by Earl Van Best himself. It was written by the priest who performed the marriage in Nevada. So then they're coming up with this whole thing. Oh, crap. Now, let's just present this to the media. Oh, Earl Van Best committed the murders, the Zodiac killer murders, and this priest in Nevada wrote the letters. Yeah, right. That is just, well, it was a media publicity stunt. This was done to sell books. That's why I say you can listen to the episodes I've done on Black Box Online Radio. I beg you not to buy that book because I honestly believe it was a scam put forward by Gary Stewart, Susan Mustafa. And as far as Michael Wachtel goes, I really don't know because he doesn't give away any of the telltale signs of lying in an interview. But Gary Stewart appears to be mostly a complete fraud. And if he wants to come on this channel or on the Zodiac Killer channel where I am a contributor, he can dispute that with me. As far as the body type of Earl Van Best being inaccurate, or that Earl Van Best is this small, skinny guy in the Zodiac at Lake Berryessa was described as being someone who was 6 feet tall and barrel-chested. I read an interview with Gary Stewart that had been posted on ZodiacCiphers.com. Big thank you to Richard. It may have actually been conducted by Richard Grinnell, or someone else, but Gary Stewart's explanation for that about how his suspect doesn't match the physical descriptions is that he was incarcerated for a while and was probably eating high-calorie prison food, and he bulked up. But where was he incarcerated, I wonder? The FX documentary exposed a very powerful lie that was put forward by either Gary Stewart or Susan Mustafa. We're not sure. But that is that Gary Stewart was provided some documents that were Earl Van Best prison records, and Earl Van Best was allegedly in a Atascadero mental hospital at the same time that Arthur Lee Allen was there. But when they had the copies actually presented of what Gary Stewart received, the word Atascadero hadn't been there. Gary Stewart invented an entirely fictitious story on how Earl Van Best was in the same mental hospital at Atascadero with Arthur Lee Allen, and that Arthur Lee Allen had received this confession from somebody there that, no, this guy in Atascadero actually confessed to being the Zodiac killer. And Gary Stewart's like, that must be Earl Van Best, my suspect, his biological father. Hello, Sigmund Freud. However, that was a blatant falsification. Somebody altered the documents. And Susan Mustafa is featured in the documentary on The Most Dangerous Animal of All. There are at least 4 parts to it. I think it's a 4-part one. I watched it last year. And she comes across as someone who just seems bewildered by all of this. But was she actually an active participant? Or, as Michael Wachtel said, she was the one whom he interacted with. Was she the architect of this whole thing? I don't know. The sad thing is, they could have written an excellent biography on Earl Van Best as a criminal, the person who was involved with this nationwide scandal, the person who was A brilliant man, a guy who grew up trilingual in English, German, and Japanese, somebody who had an extensive knowledge of British history, who had a passion for first edition books, who just seems like such a brilliant mind, but also someone who couldn't overcome his deviant tendencies. And I openly said, when I was doing that book discussion on Earl Van Best and the most dangerous animal of all, he's a Machiavellian personality. Somebody who thought that he was so smart and so cunning that he didn't have to follow the rules of society. Now, a lot of people disagree with me. A lot of people think that Earl Van Best was indeed the Zodiac Killer because of Gary Stewart's book, but guess what? It's just another version of My Daddy Was the Zodiac. Earl Van Best actually really did not like Gary Stewart, and he put him up for adoption. I believe he actually left him in a stairwell. Like, that was his variant of putting him up for adoption. He was a bad person. Brilliant, but absolutely terrible. So, one last piece that I would share with you is that it's not proven, but it's highly possible that Earl Van Best was in Austria on October 11th of 1969 at the time of the murder of Paul Stein. It also appears that there's somewhat of a falsification involving this theory that Gary Stewart and Susan Mustafa put forward about how he was living only blocks away from the Stein murder, and that Earl Van Best worked as a taxi driver for a period of time, and he felt that it was so beneath him because he's just this brilliant, self-educated, worldly person, but he had to do this menial job, and that created this animosity for taxi drivers, hence murdering Paul Stein, or maybe he even murdered Paul Stein because he knew him personally. It seems like Earl Van Best could have actually been in Austria. They theorize about that. It's like a hypothesis. It hasn't been proven, but what is proven is that Earl Van Best was married 3 times. His first wife was Marionette Player, his second wife was Judith Chandler, and his third wife was Edith Coase, who was from Austria, and they may have moved the family back there at the time of the Stein murder. If he's out of the country, then that would completely eliminate him for that crime. I think that it is a very weak but still compelling theory, though, that Gary Stewart and Susan Mustafa put forward about how this guy, Earl Van Best, is growing up. He has a terrible relationship with his mother. She's doing lots of inappropriate things. And then he goes on to get married 3 times, but really it's the second wife, Judith Chandler, Gary Stewart's biological mother, that becomes the center point in Earl Van Best's life. They even get involved in this international scandal where he abducts her, more or less. He takes her to Nevada. I believe she's 14 at the time, and they get married when this priest in Nevada signs the marriage certificate. And they just go on this international on the run spree, going to both the United States and Mexico. As I said, international. And he's just living with this underage girl. The marriage was annulled because Judith Chandler was underage. And also, Earl Van Best was someone who took her to various places. They couldn't stay in one place for very long. And then it just all came crashing down. He left Gary Stewart behind. This going on the run had to come to an end at a certain point. That's the story that I wanted to hear about. Not about, oh yeah, well, he's also the Zodiac Killer, so people will buy our book. But I think that it's a compelling theory in the sense that after the on the run time ends, then Gary Stewart's like, he targeted all the female victims because they reminded him of his biological mother, Judith Chandler. Earl Van Best targeted the female victims because they reminded him of his second wife, Judith Chandler. And you might be wondering, well, the victims don't all look the same. Well, they were on the run, right? So Judith Chandler had to dye her hair blonde. She had to dye her hair brown. She had to wear wigs. That's why there are all of these differences. You have my attention, except for the fact that you lied everywhere else, Gary Stewart. I don't think so. Well, thank you for listening to this episode. You can always like and subscribe. And if you have anything that you would like to share in the comment section down below, I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this one. And what do you think about Earl Van Best as a Zodiac Killer suspect? And please look out for the future book discussion on America's Jack the Ripper. As you see, that is the Zodiac Killer. Until next time.